Let me introduce our two other panel members very briefly, because they have outstandingly long list of accomplishments, and we could spend the next hour just going over that. So the first is Professor Ilona Kickbusch, who's the director of the Global Health Program at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Before that, she was at one point the head of the Global Health Program at Yale, but we still are happy to have her at a Harvard event. And Ilona's list of accomplishments are indeed very long, and she's arguably one of the most influential global health scholars and advocates. But the one that I sort of think of when I think about her work in terms of framing is that she has really made the argument for the health in all policies, and that pervades so much of the work that she has led. And so, Ilona, it is absolutely terrific to have you here. Thank you. And then, last but not least, is Chris Ebi, who is a professor of environmental and occupational health sciences and professor of global health at the University of Washington. Really one of the leaders in this area of thinking about susceptibility, risk, and how climate is a critical issue when we think about human health. You know, when Kamran was talking about the health of the people and the health of the planet, so much of Chris's work has highlighted to us over the years that these things are, in fact, deeply connected. And so, Chris, thank you for being here as well. So what we're going to do, it's fine. What we're going to do, and I'll sit down here, is I've asked both Ilona and Chris to just take a few minutes and offer some remarks. To the extent that they connect to what Renee talked about, that'd be great, but just broadly your reactions in thinking about bringing these two agendas together. Then I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we're going to open it up, and hopefully all of you will engage and ask questions of this fabulous panel. So, Ilona, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'd like to do that. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thanks for that very kind introduction. I'll make a couple of points. I think one point that is important is that over the last 3 to 5 years, the awareness in the health community has grown considerably about the interface of climate and health. And I think also that the World Health Organization has really contributed to that and is working very hard on it. And some of you might have even seen those pollution pads that WHO built on occasion of the discussions right now at the UN General Assembly. And I think the important thing here is that WHO is really contributing to the thinking that this is not about the future. WHO clearly says climate change is killing us now. And I think that also relates to some of the maps and the points that you made. And the Director General said very clearly, it is felt in our hospitals and our lungs. 7 million people die every year from air pollution. So I think we can see that point one, this awareness in the health community is growing, and there is a responsibility on health organizations to increase it even more, so that, you know, the really on-the-ground points that you made are really in every health professional's mind, because they're not yet. But that the leading organization is moving, I think, could be important. Because secondly, I think health could be an extraordinary leader in the climate change debate through the non-communicable disease agenda. And again, the NCD agenda has frequently been seen much too narrowly, and of course there are those people that see it just as, you know, individual change or something. But if you were to construct the NCD agenda around SDG 12, sustainable production and consumption, and you think about food, just think about food, the production of food, what we eat, how it's grown, how it's sold, how it travels around the world, etc., that would give the global health community an unimaginable leadership role around climate change. It has not yet taken that. And there have been some indications, a recent, I'll say it carefully, very softly, Lancet report on which was about eating and yes, you've got it there. Good. What's its exact title?
Global Syndemic of Obesity, Undernutrition and Climate Change.
Yeah.
I've got some copies going on the way.
Yeah. So I think
who is that person? I'm kidding. We welcome you
there
here.
is a tremendous leadership opportunity that the health community has not yet taken on. The health community itself still runs the NCD agenda as a medical agenda, and it is not. To some extent, there's a bit of discussion around determinants of health and a few taxes here and something there. But I think the potential, particularly around sustainable consumption and production, is critical, SDG 12. That leads to my third point. This is really about new economic models. And Kamran alluded to it. And we've got to, if we act in this field, we have to look at macroeconomics. And we have to see how the global financial flows are, what the GDP costs are respectively, and how we bring those arguments across. And if we sort of say, okay, there's 7 million dying from air pollution, the costs of that are around $5 trillion US. The whole health economy at present is $7.5 trillion. Just try and relate that to each other. Now, a lot of those trillions are not in those yellow countries that you have over there. Therefore, thinking about how the investment must be and what the macroeconomic and financing models are that will allow that investment is incredibly important, and we're not yet very good at making those examples. And you've said, sort of make climate change the responsibility also of each health professional, but also the other way round, make health the responsibility of every climate professional. Because if we look at the climate funds that are dispersed, 0.5% of the climate funds that are dispersed go to health. And they should be going to exactly the kind of questions that you have raised and support particularly those countries. Last point I'd make at this stage is really that we have to link it also in terms of economic models to some of those innovative models that are out there. What do certain suggestions, be it the suggestion of a donut economy or similar proposals, what do they mean? I come from Europe. The European Union presidency of Finland has just suggested, together with the OECD, a new economic approach called the well-being economy, which also takes into account climate change. So I think really we need these two levels of action. We need really these fantastic examples at the coalface that you've put forward. And we need to have the courage to say, if the SDGs call for this incredible transformation, that we look at one issue and we have to have all the others around it. I always run round with the WHO soup plate. It happens to have put SDG 3 in the middle and you have all the others around. But, put climate change in the middle, you have the others. Put SDG 12 in the middle and you have the others. And each one has to be called responsible for everyone else. And we just cannot avoid that. We have an accumulation of risk that will cost many, many people their lives, and we must take on that responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Professor Ibai.
Those are very comprehensive comments, and I'd like to follow up on just a couple of them to add a little bit more perspective. I've been working in this field for almost 25 years, and much of my life is spent in low and middle income countries. So talking a little bit about the kinds of things that I see. I'd like to start first on the whole question of leadership. The World Health Organization has been working very hard on this issue for 25 years. They really have been working to raise awareness, to try and have ministries of health around the world understand the challenges that are coming their way. I've never seen a field like climate change in health in terms of where you see the awareness. Heads of government go every year to an annual meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Heads of governments are here, and they sign off on agreements about climate change, about reducing their emissions, about increasing their ambition for adaptation. Health is always as part of these agreements. So we have awareness at the level, the highest level of government. And then when you come down to the next level, it's not there. So in the United States, we had President Obama in an asthma ward talking about climate change and health. The total funding from our National Institutes of Health on climate change and health is 0.04% of their budget. It is not a priority. And it's been a real challenge, not just here, the funding's similar in Europe, the funding's about the same in Australia. Canada's been shifting with their new prime minister. So we don't have resources. It's very difficult within ministries of health because you see the same kinds of challenges. That when you look within countries, some countries have reorganized all their ministries and have a minister of climate change. And yet the engagement with the minister of health is often pretty weak. There are some countries where it's working really quite well. So we have a leadership challenge within this field. In order to move forward on bringing these agendas together, we need to see how to move our leadership to really take this issue on board. We also need to make sure that as they finally do take this issue on board, that the resources are there. We have basically no resources to face significant challenges in these countries. When you look at the adaptation funds under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, 1% has gone to health. I go to countries where the distance from the main hospital to the coast is less than from me to the camera. You start seeing storm surges, which have a nonlinear increase with sea level rise. They're being inundated. They are putting sandbags around them. They can't stay. But there's no one who's going to fund them to move. So we're facing lots of challenges from within our own sector in trying to protect and promote health. I'd like to add two other points. One is Renee did an outstanding went through and did an outstanding presentation talking about the kinds of health risks that we are facing now, will likely face in the future. There's others that are coming onto the agenda that are even larger. I've been working on the issue recently of carbon dioxide and what it does to the nutritional quality of our food. There's various estimates of what that means. As carbon dioxide goes up, 85% of the plants on Earth have a mechanism that they use to bring the carbon into the plant. It causes the plant to grow faster. It becomes more water efficient. Micronutrients decline about 5 to 10%. We have 850 million people in the world who are food insecure. We have 2 billion that have got micronutrient deficiencies. We have something like 1.5 billion women and girls who've got iron deficiency anemia. And that reduction in those micronutrients like iron and like zinc not only affects us, it also affects livestock. So it's coming to us from the food we eat, but also from the protein we get from various animals. At the same time, there's a mechanism in the plant where you're seeing essentially a competition between carbon and nitrogen. You see a reduction in nitrogen compounds. That translates into about a 10% reduction in protein. And we estimated, particularly for rice, the reduction in the B vitamins can be around 30%. We estimated just for the most rice-dependent countries, the poorest rice-dependent countries, we're talking 600 million people. That doesn't consider wheat, which is a main cereal crop for many people in the world, and it doesn't include climate change. We're talking easily over 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion people could be affected. And I'll go back to, we don't have the funding to better understand this. The last point I would like to make is that as we think about what we need to do, and Renee had a very good list of what we need to do, is the climate continues to change. We're aiming at a moving target. I was an author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Special Report on Warming of 1.5 degrees. And one of the things that we showed in the chapter on impacts, chapter 3, was if you look at what a 1.5 world could look like from the climate models, and that's between 2030 and 2052, so a very short time from now. When you look at the range of temperature changes, regional temperature changes in a 1.5 world, it ranges from, for most of the US, essentially no change for another ½ degree of warming to almost 3 degrees of warming. Again, between 2030 and 2052. Those are equally probable. We are not prepared for where we are today. And if the rate of climate change accelerates, we are so far underprepared that it's frightening to think about how we're going to manage in a world with that much temperature change. And we have to. We really have to think about what these different probabilities mean and what it means for how we are going to adapt, how quickly we're going to mitigate, how we're going to communicate the changes, how we're going to have the entire population with us so that we can ensure that we reduce as much as possible the projected health risks of a changing climate. Thank you.
So, a bunch of really important thoughts, and I want to get us started with a bit of a provocative question, which is, I would argue, and first of all, you may disagree with the premise of this question, in which case I'd love to hear that, but that until very recently, last 3 to 5 years, climate change was framed, at least to the general public, as sea level increases, temperature rises, which, and maybe somewhere down in 2050, 2070. But the health lens, or as we often say, health is really the human face of climate change, that link between health and climate has only happened, I think, at least in my mind, much more recently. So first, do you agree with that there has been a transition? You have been working on this for a while. So I'm not saying
Some of
you're
us made
late.
That connection
a long time ago.
Yeah.
But my question.
It's not a surprise, yeah.
No, you've actually done the work that has made that connection,
Yeah,
so I'm not. But the question is, why has it been so hard for that connection to hit the kind of upper levels of the policy world? Because that is a much more compelling case for action than sea level rises and temperature changes, which feel kind of ethereal and not so compelling. So you've done the work on this, but the question is, why have we as a public health community not done a better job? Or why has it taken so long for us to make the policy case? Maybe that's the question.
I'll connect two themes.
And this is not a personal criticism of anybody on the panel.
Don't worry about it. So yes, it's been a really a hard slog to make that awareness. And there's a couple of factors I think are important. One is climate change was initially framed as an environmental problem.
Yep.
It comes about ozone, other issues. So it was clearly framed as environmental, picked up very strongly by environmental groups. It was not picked up well in health, and one of the reasons I think so, and I'm not going to blame you, is that when you look at public health, and I'll just focus mostly on the OECD countries, it's run by MDs who frankly are out of step with the entire medical community. If I was diagnosed with cancer, I'd have an oncologist, a nutritionist, a psychologist, I would have my family in counseling. that when you look at medicine, they have moved over the decades to systems-based approaches. When you look at population health, I was talking to Dick Jackson yesterday, it's like whack-a-mole. This thing pops up and you pound it down. This thing pops up, you pound it down. There's no systems-based thinking. I was at a meeting of the Consortium of the Universities of Global Health 2 years ago, right after Zika hit the United States. And there was high-level people from NIH and from CDC spent 45 or 50 minutes talking about emerging infectious diseases. And they didn't say the word environment once. It was diagnosis, it was treatment, it was anything we can do about genetics, about developing vaccines. There was not any discussion of why in Brazil was it the favelas? What was it about the favelas? There was almost nothing about vulnerability. It was based on an assumption that if you are exposed, if there's a disease out there, you are exposed. Well, we know from the environmental field that just because something's there doesn't mean you're exposed. There's a whole range of reasons why you become exposed, personal factors, on and on. And so when you look really at where we are today in terms of our health systems, in terms of our approaches, we're way far behind in looking at the systems that need to be studied, need to be intervened on. And I think that climate change is going to fundamentally change public health, that we have to move into considering these systems in the Anthropocene, and what is it that we need to do to ensure that we can protect our health.
So Ilona, do you agree, first of all, with the premise that the public health community has not done as good of a job until recently in connecting the health agenda and the climate agenda?
I agree. Yep.
And if yes, why and how do we make sure that we keep it going?
Well, point one, I agree that they haven't. That's true. I would not agree with you, at least the public health community I work with is all about health and all policies and about bringing together, the decisions in other sectors to work for health. So it might be true for the American public health community, and maybe that's one of the reasons I left to go back to Europe. But definitely there is a much greater understanding of what we call intersectorality, etc. But one of the problems of that public health community is that they have been so focused on the social determinants of health. They have been so concerned with inequalities and those issues that they have neglected the, in quotes, environmental and climate issues. And they are now grappling to catch up with those. Now, that is, though, a very important challenge, because the big debate, at least in Europe, where I live right now, is how do we balance those two agendas? How do we ensure that, in quotes, the cost of climate change, all the stuff we need to do, does not fall also in our part of the world on the poorest? And that's one of the reasons why my own country, Germany, has come up with such a weak climate consensus, because they're dead scared of their voters. And particularly the Social Democratic Party thinks that, if these suggestions are put forward, their voters who are, within a certain group will, they'll just lose them. On the other hand, the Green Party at present in Germany is at 28+%. So, there's some disconnect here that we need to understand politically. But the public health community in Europe tends to be more also on that side of the political spectrum. So we've got this this lack of understanding of how do we bring those determinants together. And the environmental determinants have always been understood as so environmental rather than as so systemic. And my NCD argument relates to that it's only recently that people are waking up and saying, oh, the environment is not just the old public health, because that's another reason, oh no, should we deal with the old public health, water, air, that kind of stuff, or the really fancy new public health. So I think those are a whole number of the reasons, and we need to bring that together. But also, I might add, at least a fair amount of the climate community and the environmental advocates that I got to know also in the Green Party said humans aren't important. They did not want an anthropo lens on the climate issue. They explicitly said, we do not want to listen to you. We're not interested in people. We want to save the planet. And so from both sides, you've had a problem. And I think that's the challenge and the opportunity we have right now, also through the SDGs, through the discussions this week here at the UN General Assembly, and through this increasing awareness. And I think the frustration of people like you who've worked on this forever and then say, my God, when are they going to wake up? I can fully understand that. If I can say one more thing.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because it's related to WHO. Some of you, are definitely not interested and probably shouldn't be in sort of bureaucratic machinations of that organization. But it has come up with a new general program of work. And within that, it has reinstated the whole area of determinants of health under a heading of healthy populations. And now they are challenged because the social determinants, the environmental determinants, and other determinants are all in one grouping. And the Director General has now given out the challenge to that team. You've got to sort this out. You've got to take it forward. And migration is part of that team, where, social and environmental come together in quite some brutality at some stage. So I think, here is something where we have an opportunity to move forward and actually use that momentum. I feel we can't afford to lose this opportunity. And therefore, there's a tremendous responsibility also on the public health community.
So one quick comment, then another provocative question. So actually, the comment I was thinking about when you were talking, Ilona, about the Green Party is one of my heroes in America is a woman named Gina McCarthy, who ran the Environmental Protection Agency under President Obama. She's a firebrand. Renee knows her well. And she said once, I didn't run the Environmental Protection Agency, I ran the People Protection Agency. I care about the environment, but I care about the environment because it affects the health of the people. And that framing, that's a tension in the environmental community because not everybody sees the world that way. Yeah. Here's my sort of other provocative question, then I'm going to open it up to the audience. There is a reasonable set of arguments that says that for the world's poor, access to cheap energy is critical to their health and their well-being. And people bring up that the climate change agenda, to the extent that it makes super cheap energy, even if it's dirty energy, harmful energy, if it's super cheap, it makes it harder to access, it raises the cost of energy, and the world's poor will suffer from it. And argues that these two agendas that we have tried to argue are actually well aligned, fighting climate, getting UHC. In fact, there are people who argue that these things are at tension with each other. Thoughts, responses. There is a kernel of truth to the idea, certainly, that for the world's poor, cheap energy is really important, or access to energy is very important. Mm-hmm. Chris, then Ilona, and then Renee.
Access to energy is critical, and we know that. We know that in our own countries as we developed, access to refrigeration made a huge difference. And so they do need, they require, and they really should have access to energy. And it is an interesting question of how you do that. And that's been the tension in the negotiations all along, that the low and middle income countries have come to the negotiation saying, we deserve the right to develop. And they do. And you can't tell us we can't develop because you don't want us to use coal. And one of the many challenges in the convention is that no president, no prime minister of any country can give away their technology. President Obama couldn't go to General Electric and say, give me your latest technology so I can give it to another country. So there's all kinds of challenges around intellectual property and how to get around those issues. And the answer in the end is what President Obama started to do, was really invest in our Department of Energy to find alternative sources of energy. When you look now, I forgot the exact number, but every year there's something around $4 to $5 trillion in subsidies every year for oil and gas. If you took away the subsidies for oil and gas, renewables would be more than competitive. And having better technology, better battery technology is really critical. So there's some significant knowledge gaps that need to be filled, investing in those so that IP can be translated to low and middle income countries, and it's starting to happen. That you see with cell phones, it doesn't matter where you go in any country of the world, people have got access to cell phones. Landlines are not going to be an issue in low and middle income countries, they're just never going to put them in. They've all got the cell phones. We can do this as well with energy. I was watching Innovation Nation, and they had this short segment about what happened in Willow Run outside of Detroit before the US even got into World War II, and how they built a factory and started producing fighter planes, and at the top of production, they could produce a fighter plane every hour. They did just a massive amount of change within their companies, changing within their tooling, changing their technologies. We did it for World War II. Everybody likes to talk about the space race because that's a little bit more fun to talk about than to talk about war, but we know we can do this. It's having the political will to make it happen.
Ilona, the tension, do you see it as a tension between cheap energy for the world's poor and fighting climate change, or no?
Well, of course. I mean, the inequalities are so large, and they are there for everything, you know, food, energy, whatever. And even, you know, where we have this big hype now of making Africa digital, there's an energy component within that. So, you know, there's a load of choices that need to be made. I mean, to some extent, the issues also clearly came out in the climate summit and some of the more emotional statements during that summit. That is that, you know, many of the politicians in the developed world just don't have the courage. And even where it seems, at least if you take popular surveys, that the majority of people is somehow for a new kind of policy, they just do not have the courage to move forward. And again, you know, my own country, Germany, has been the ultimate example. It's very interesting. Switzerland right now, the country where I live, is discussing a levy on airline travel, and it will probably go through, and it will probably go to a popular vote, given, you know, Switzerland's system of democracy. So, funnily enough, you know, they are more willing to move forward than some of the countries that have presented themselves as leaders. But you see, I think also the West acts here, other geopolitical leaders are stepping in. I mean, we can see what is being developed in terms of innovation in China. We can see it in India. And they are going to use that geopolitically because they are going to help, in quotes partly, but also in real life. Who is building the infrastructure in Africa? It's China. And what are they applying? They are applying what they are learning in terms of building a more environmentally friendly approach to their own very, very rapid development. And so I think we're going to see very significant shifts here. And a fair bit of that, of course, for our part of the world does lie in fiscal policy, which includes getting rid of certain subsidies, which needs to be discussed clearly also with the population, what will get more expensive and what not. And I guess, you know, just spending time here in conference rooms where after 1 hour I'm freezing. I just wonder, you know, even some rather smaller steps could have a significant impact. And so I believe we have to face that. But we also mustn't fall into a trap, because if I go to you know, recent discussions we've had also in this part of the world around the sugar tax or around tobacco taxes, the first thing that certain companies come then and say, this is inequitable. You are hurting the poor first. They won't be able to buy a soda can anymore. And so we have to be very clear in our arguments and how things are balanced and who benefits and who doesn't. So, but I think, you know, in terms of governance, and you're quite right, we have some very clear things we could do today, or if not tomorrow, but the Western countries just don't dare to do them. It's as simple as that.
So Renee, I'm going to ask you, you've, in your piece, tried to link these two agendas as intrinsically heading in the same direction. I remember at least one of the reviewers, and by the way, one of the things I love about BMJ is that every review is available online with people's names. So you can look up, like one of the reviewers basically suggested that these various SDGs were often at tensions with each other. And that in fact, UHC and climate change, fighting climate change, achieving UHC, might be at tension with each other. Do you see that as a tension, or do you think that the issues around cheap energy get swamped by the massive negative health effects of climate change on the world's poor?
It's a great question and hard to top these fantastic answers. But I think what I would add is that for anyone who thinks that there's tension there, I would argue and pose that they're currently sitting within the box of how things have been done. And I would argue that we need to knock those walls down and step outside of the box, because this meta problem of climate crisis that literally touches everything needs bold, innovative solutions. And so we can't think the way that we have thought. And I think that's one of the things that gives me hope about climate change, is the fact that I think, you know, we keep talking, and I think it's been highlighted in the discussion thus far, that we have worked in our sectors with our walls up and our heads down, but we need to knock those down and join together as a community and think of how we can connect these things in novel ways. And I think that this, you know, true threat to our existence, I'm hoping will do that. So I think that the tension, I would argue, is within our existing framework, but I think that we can find synergies to move it forward in a way that is able to achieve everything with the novelty and ingenuity that we have shown, and especially from a technological standpoint.
Great. So we have about 30 minutes before one of our panelists has to leave to go catch a train. So let me open it up to the audience. My only request is introduce yourself and ask one question. And if you can keep it to one question, yes. One. And I don't know if we have mics, and if not, oh, we do. No, it's just for the recording purposes. I think it'll be helpful if we can use the mic.
Good evening. I'm Rachel Thompson, currently at the World Obesity Federation, which is why I was, Ilona's words were music to my ears when she mentioned the global syndemic. A question which is quite a big one, but it's something, I'm at day 5 of UNGA now, so I'm on to the big questions, is I'm wondering, as the public health, global health community, do we have a position? Are we for growth, economic growth, or are we challenging it enough? I know Ilona mentioned the need to transform the macroeconomic system, etc., which we hear a lot because we know the common drivers of poor health and climate change are related to the current system. But are we actually engaging in this? Is anyone here working on transforming the global economic system? So yeah, that's my question for you to reflect on. Thank you.
Are we pro-growth, folks?
I would turn the question around and ask, why are you asking that?
Because I'm biased by the global syndemic, which shows us that the current economic system is leading to rising obesity everywhere, undernutrition still in many places at the same time as creating a climate crisis. And we know that it's the underlying global economic system, which I would call neoliberal, that is at the heart of this. And so all these conversations which we're having, which are great, by the way, to link health and climate, I would actually say we're not linking in UHC very much in any of these side events. I'm not sure if anyone would agree. But yeah, I think how far can we go with this agenda without, as public health, global health people, really getting into the grits of this? And I know Ilona's work on divestment and these things is good. And are we actually going to come together on this, or are we just going to keep talking about the symptoms that we're seeing in our own sectors? Thank you.
So it's a big and provocative but important.
It's an important question. My personal perspective is everyone's got roles and responsibilities. And we do the best when we play to our roles and responsibilities. I do work with people who are working on energy transformation issues. It's complicated, requires a significant amount of understanding, and it comes down to how much each individual wants to spend to invest their time into that question over other questions. Personally, I focus on the intersection with health. So you mentioned synergies and trade-offs. We have almost no understanding of synergies and trade-offs. There's some recent work coming out for the lowest emission pathway that's being used, RCP 2.6, that in that world there's a tremendous amount of biofuels, which takes a lot of land away from agriculture, which increases the price of food, which will likely increase food insecurity. I'm more interested in looking at the synergies and trade-offs in these intersections to make sure that I can bring back useful information to the partners that I engage with to think about how, if in fact those decisions are taken to move to that particular emission pathway, we can ensure that we understand, to the extent possible, what the implications could be for health and how we can best promote health in those situations. There's others who are engaging much more directly in questions around the economic system and how the economic system could be structured to be more effective. So I don't see that there's any one answer to that. It has to be, we have limited amount of time, limited amount of energy, and where do we think it's most effective for us to put what we have to give?
Ilona.
Well, first of all, there's significant parts of the public health community that are engaged in such political discussions, like the People's Health Movement and others, and there's a whole range of analyses that brings the sort of neoliberal capitalist analyses together with health issues. So a fair bit of academic work has also been done here. I personally, I must say, I'm much more interested in trying to understand how some of the newer economic models relate to these integrated challenges that we face, which is why I sort of mentioned the donut economy model, the welfare economy model. I personally think some of these old classifications on economics don't really work that well anymore. And I think that's also reflected in, at least in Europe, in the difficulty some political parties face, because the old arguments don't seem to relate to people's lives at this point. And therefore, I think rather than use a whole range of older classifications, even though they've served us well in the past, I don't think they will serve us for the future. And therefore, this challenge that you've put forward of being transformative in our thinking, I think also relates to these issues, new forms of equity, inequities, how the whole climate discussion actually fits a political and political economy dialogue. I don't think we're there, quite honestly, and the old discussions seem to me a bit stale sometimes.
Renee, any reflections? You can.
Yeah. I mean, I think in summary, in my views, I mean, the pro-economic growth in our current existing system, no, it's obviously not working. But I do believe that we can create a transformative one that puts health and well-being, not only of us and humans, but also our planet at the center. And I do believe that we can develop that, but it's going to take multi-sectoral integrated approach to, and a commitment to recognize that money cannot be the only driver.
Really quick thing I just want to add, if I can, is really reflecting on Ilona's point of the kind of classic left-right debate feels increasingly anachronistic. If you look, first of all, economic growth is incredibly important for pulling people out of poverty. What has happened in China and India the last 30 years is nothing short of miraculous in terms of close to 1 billion people pulled out of poverty. A lot of it is from economic growth. So it's really hard sitting in New York or Geneva to say to people in Africa, hey, we've got economic growth. Sorry, we've used up our carbon allotment. Good luck, Godspeed. Like, that's not going to work. And what's interesting is watching American politics, watching European politics, it's really hard to tell what's left and what's right from an economics point of view. A ton of Donald Trump's policies, well, there are a lot of them are just crazy, but a bunch of them like just don't fit. Like they're not quite right, they're not quite left. And it makes you realize that the way we've thought about these issues just have to, we have to take a very different approach. And so, at least from my perspective, and I'm moderating, but I'll just say, we have to be pro-growth, but it can't be the way that we've thought about growth in the last 30 years. We have to have a new model for thinking about what growth looks like that's much more sustainable. But that's my opinion. I just thought I'd throw in it. All right, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Andrea Vogt from Global Health Strategies. My question is about...
One sec.
Thank you. Andrea Vogt from Global Health Strategies. My question is about how we can better draw alliances with the climate community. I think that this presentation had really compelling arguments for why the health community should think about climate change and integrate it into its own agenda. The links are super compelling, but the reality is that to have an integrated approach, we do need to build alliances with a totally different sector that has different budgets and different priorities. How can we argue for the climate community, environmental community to see the links with health, given some of the discussions you've already had about how they don't just think about human health, they think more broadly?
It's a great question, and I'm going to just expand it a tiny bit by saying, Ilona, I've heard you talk about, you put SDG 3 at the center and think about all the others, 12, whichever one. But there is a broader question here about how do we link agendas across SDGs, across areas, more effectively than we have? And we could start with getting the climate community and the health community working much more effectively together. But what are the mechanisms? How do we do this beyond writing great papers in BMJ that say these things are linked and we all can see it? But it's hard to go from that to people across these sectors working more effectively together. So I'm going to start with you, Ilona, but I'd love, Chris, Renee, for you guys to weigh in as well.
Well, I think on the one hand, quite simply, the issue is, what are these SDGs actually about? In a way, they're not about these 17 areas that have then been put together in this circle, but they're really about what does it take in this complicated world to give people a better life. And that also means if you want to change policies, you need to have people behind you. So I think one of the issues of bringing the climate, environmental, and health community together is to develop a joint narrative in the sense that, what we are doing here, because politicians will need the support of people for policies. And, a number of those policies are going to be not easy to live with at first instance. We will need to change the way we live, simply. And also, you know, with China or whoever else helping, the model of growth in developing countries will be more complex than it was in the past. Because, you know, they already now have to think, as we grow now, how will we not destroy our society 20 years down the road? So where do we invest now? So they have to face questions we never needed to face, and therefore they need their population on side. So I think, you know, really saying what are the arguments that will bring people on side, because politicians respond to people. And I think all of us have not done enough around that. And that, you know, applies to NCDs as much as to climate, as much as to a whole range of other health and societal issues. Because, you know, if on the other hand, people start to have fears of, you know, climate authoritarianism or, you know, health fascism, as it's been called, you know, it's something where, as professionals, communities, I think we can make a tremendous contribution in telling the story, and telling that story well based on evidence. And the story has to be related to people and their lives, and particularly in the lives of their children and the future. And if children themselves now say, look, you are destroying our future, then, you know, we'd better come up with something.
Chris, you've been thinking about this intersection between health and climate and these two movements. Advice for how we do this better across these communities?
There's been tremendous movement over the last 25 years. I'm pretty privileged in where I sit, in the engagements I've had. There are really no barriers for health engaging with other sectors. The only barrier is the lack of funding. So if you look within the United States, all of our agencies have mission mandates. And so if you want to do some work with colleagues who get most of their funding from the National Science Foundation, the National Science Foundation is not supposed to fund health. Yep. It's supposed to be NIH. And if NIH isn't doing funding, you have a barrier. So we've got barriers from our funding structures. It's not barriers of interest. It's not barriers of intention. There's really no challenges there whatsoever. The funding, I also say, creates other barriers. So within universities, you've got structures within universities. I've been at a university now for 5 years, and the number of students in my classes is growing exponentially. The students want interdisciplinary training. They want to be able to work across sectors. And frankly, universities are just another money-making organization, and they're structured in a particular way, and if federal agency said you have to change your structure so that your students all have the opportunity for interdisciplinary work, and that's the only way you're going to get research funding, I think they change pretty quickly, even at a place like Harvard.
No doubt. Funding
And
is
that, by the way, you know, the budgetary processes, the regulatory stuff that goes with it is among the proposals of the new governance we need. For example, by the new UNDP OECD governance center that's been set up in relation to the SDGs. So I think we'll see, first of all, examples of where that has worked, and secondly, proposals how that institutional cooperation is supported through regulation and through financing mechanisms. Absolutely critical governance approaches that we will need, and again, you know, that need the political courage to actually move ahead.
And I'll give an example. I was in Indonesia several years ago, and the former prime minister made climate change number 1, number 2 on his agenda. And all of the ministries reported to the prime minister. on climate change. And there was several years where the ministries met on a regular basis to talk about climate change, to collaborate on climate change. The current Prime Minister moved climate change back into the Ministry of the Environment, but after this long history of working together, the ministries really work together. I went to a farmer field school to look at paddies because they're getting saltwater intrusion into the paddies. And someone came with me from the Ministry of Health. There's all kinds of health issues that came out during the discussions. And so representatives from the Ministry of Health said, oh, in the farmer field schools, we're going to put in some components around the health issues that they care about. And so they're making it work because they've got the political structure or the history of the political structure that really foster that collaboration at the highest level.
Before we go on to the next comment, just one thing reflecting on, you were talking about even Harvard would respond. Sort of sharing a little, yeah, no, I like it. Sharing a little bit of dirty laundry of our own institution. 5 years ago, when I took over the Global Health Institute and thought about what are the big looming threats to global public health, climate change is like right there. And so I thought, you know, we think of ourselves as a university that tackles the big topics, at least that's what we tell ourselves. And so I thought, surely we have a whole cadre of people working on this. Right. And so I went to the climate people and they're like, health, adaptation, it'll be fine, health is not the issue. And I went to my health colleagues who said, we've got TB and malaria and HIV, and you want us to think about climate change like 100 years from now, maybe 50 years from now. And it took about 2 years of arm twisting, and there were a couple of people, and they were all junior. The Renee Salas, the Ari Bernstein, who saw it immediately. But my colleagues, the gray-haired guys, and mostly guys, a few women too, didn't see this as like a topic worth thinking about.
This could be a gender issue.
It could be a gender issue. I think we've got some empirical evidence behind that. But this is a problem in our community, and it was amazing how much work it was to convince both of these communities that like the intersection between health and climate is enormously important. And that, I think, there are a few universities, the University of Washington is, I think, has been unusual in how much it is. But you can probably count in one hand the number of American universities that have really done extraordinary work on climate and health. And so it is a...
Money.
What's that?
There's no money.
There's no money. That's a big part of the challenge.
Right.
Sorry, please.
Hi, I'm Jenny Miller with the Global Climate and Health Alliance. And a number of the questions and answers and conversation that we've had so far have kind of hinted at this, but I wanted to ask it in a more pointed way. There are a number of interests that are well vested in the way things are done now, in the fossil fuel economy, et cetera. And they've been very successful for literally decades at doing things like undermining the science, discrediting environmentalists. I think possibly one of the reasons that the health sector has been a bit slow to get into the space is the risks to professional reputations as being seen as too activist. So those are very entrenched interests. What do, from your perspectives, what do you see as the potential that we have? What should we be doing to tackle that kind of very political question? I mean, we have solutions that aren't being implemented because of political barriers.
Environmental health is a history of doing that.
Yeah.
Tobacco. When you just start looking at all the stories, environmental health has always had to do that.
I mean, public health has done that since public health exists.
Right. John Snow.
And you know, you just have to be ready for that. Some colleagues are, some are not. And some, you know, are influenced in a variety of ways. I mean, I spent a fair number of years at the World Health Organization and also had to experience, you know, all the intricate ways in which influence was exerted, and it didn't need to come directly from those companies. It was, you know, the countries of where those companies were that then spoke on their behalf. And my last experience was in the NCD Commission, where the discussions around sugar tax were thrown off the agenda because of a country that most of you know well.
We might even be near that country right now.
I think this has always happened, and you will find people along the spectrum, those that let themselves be paid, and those that fight against it, and that's in environment as much as in public health. And there have been extraordinarily courageous people in public health that I have enormous respect for, and there's always new issues that come up, and that's where also then there is the opportunity to come together, because if you think in terms of taxation, in terms of subsidies and everything, and that's the divestment agenda we have been looking at. If those large insurers and pension funds, for example, or sovereign wealth funds that stop investing in fossil fuel, will now hopefully also stop investing in tobacco. So there's fantastic alliances, both actually endanger your lungs, so you can even bring it together medically. But it's really, there are tremendous opportunities. And but then the question comes, how supportive are the institutions where these courageous academics are? And one must say that they're particularly in countries where there is a lot of private money in research and in universities, it is sometimes more difficult to be as courageous as in publicly funded universities.
Though it depends, and what's interesting about that is if you think about when the government fails, so we've had almost no public funding of gun research, and very little public funding of climate research. And almost all of that has been through private funds, because when the government fails, you need an alternative source to be able to do it.
Yeah. But we don't even have those foundations.
Right.
Because.
Right. Renee?
I would say I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that there is still discussions in the medical community that there sometimes can be this chasm between kind of the public health and actually like the medical community and practicing clinicians. And I think the medical community is still struggling, and some do still view this as a, quote, political issue, which it doesn't have to be, but they are actively trying to think how to combat the disinformation or misinformation. And I think the belief is that, truth will win out, but the chorus, I'd like to believe it, if the chorus is amplified by the medical community, and I think the evidence is very clear that, for example, physicians are the most trusted resource for climate and health information. Sorry to say it, but even at least polls by more than like WHO or UN, and so people will listen to your primary care physician, and that's actually true even for people who do not believe the science around climate change. They will listen to their primary care physician as much as they will listen to their religious leaders or their neighbors, or even more so. But I think there has to be this unison of this chorus standing up and really amplifying what the truth is and what these connections are. And I think that tide is coming. And I think large institutions are looking to step forward in that voice and combat it head on. And I'd like to remain hopeful and optimistic that again, the truth will win. But.
Back there, and then I've been very one-sided, so I'll see if there's any questions on this side.
Hi, my name is Soon Young Yoon. In this setting, I'm representing the Women's Environment and Development Organization. We are an organization devoted to women's human rights and the environment. And a little bit like Kristi, we are at the climate change negotiations, helping to organize the women's gender constituency there. I am wondering whether or not the Harvard Global Health Institute would consider convening a scientific working group that included representatives from the women's health movement, and to try to develop a narrative that we desperately need, which is scientifically based, which will connect women's human rights, in particular sexual and reproductive health rights, with a healthy city, with a healthy climate. And if you can do that for us, we promise to be there.
So let me just say, just because you brought up the Harvard Global Health Institute, I would be delighted to, and I think actually the intellectual underpinnings behind that are actually pretty substantial and pretty strong. There's, I think, very good evidence that investing in women, investing in women's health, writ large, beyond just sexual and reproductive health, has all sorts of benefits, but including environmental ones and including ones that benefit climate change. So I'd be delighted to have that conversation and think about what else we can do.
Well, I think we should thank Ashish for this beautifully gender-balanced panel.
I feel like I was...
Particularly with all these men on the pictures in the room.
I know. So that I have no control over, and this is...
Thank you, Ashish.
Yeah, the walls are much more about... this is why the Harvard Club is great, and I appreciate all the people who work here, but there's always a challenge of coming to the Harvard Club, but thank you. Any questions from this side? Yes.
Hi, good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank all the speakers for your time. My name is Sherelle. I'm a recent MPH graduate. And we talk about often these topics in a much broader sense. Let's make alliances, let's make policy change, let's get funding. But what do you feel within your respective industries of health would be an action point that would make a significant difference towards achieving effective universal health care?
Vote.
It matters enormously.
It does. Yeah. That's what I tell my students. The one most important thing they can do is vote. We keep talking about political will. So you get political will by voting for it.
So first of all, I completely agree, but I'm going to push back.
Okay, go for it.
Just because we started off that way and it's been fun. So of course, in a democracy, people not showing up to vote has incredible effects as we are living through in our country. But politicians, interestingly, are not sort of independent agents and we pick the right one. They respond enormously to pressure from their constituents, whoever their constituents are, citizens, companies, et cetera. So beyond voting, it feels to me like there's a lot we can do. And I go back to thinking again about Gina McCarthy. And Gina, those of you who don't know, Gina McCarthy was EPA director under President Obama. She's awesome. And she's like a firebrand. And one of the things that she says is when we withdrew from the Paris Accord and everybody was feeling really despondent. We haven't withdrawn, thank you. When we said we were going to withdraw.
Correct.
Her point was, she said, like, her words, pull up your big boy pants, stop whining, and get to work, because if you put pressure on politicians, they have no choice but to respond, even ones that you were not excited got elected. So that's just, I'm not really pushing back, but I am saying, beyond voting, what else can we do to make sure that our political leaders and our policymakers are responding to this collective agenda?
So two comments. Elizabeth Warren the other day made a comment that personnel is policy. And so really pushing on who the personnel are is an incredibly important agenda. The second is, I'll go back to when Clinton was president. This may shock some of the younger people in the room, but the National Institutes of Health was not funding research on breast cancer because they said women are too complicated. It's only a couple, I'm not making this up, only a couple of years ago, it was only a couple of years ago did NIH mandate that all the animal studies include female animals, that all of the studies were done on males because they found it too difficult to manage the complexities of women. There were 1 million women who signed a petition that went to the president to say breast cancer has to be studied. And President Clinton did the only thing he could do. He gave money to Department of Defense. So most of the breast cancer research that was done in the US for many years was done through the Department of Defense because the National Institutes of Health were not ready yet. So the kinds of things that you're engaged in here and this week in thinking about the kinds of proactive pressure that could be put to try and make those kinds of changes. And change can be made by an individual. We've seen that here within the US, we've seen it in other places, that you do have power as people. And it's more than just going out on the street, but it's also thinking of very specific actions in your location that you can help move forward. Because when you look subnationally, you start seeing how much is going on around climate change. When you look at how many hundreds of cities have made pledges, when you look at how many hundreds of companies have made pledges, there's a huge amount of activity going on, and we want to really promote what those groups are doing and help them in as many ways that we can.
Ilona?
Well, it's the same thing. Obviously, it's vote and it's voice. And voice means different things. It means voices that come through the community. It's voices that come from different levels of governance. You mentioned cities and mayors, etc., that are very critical. But it's also the voices of the professional organizations and agencies and the foundations and the research bodies. And in some cases, they need to be a bit louder. And particularly now in the age of social media, the voice has to become even more important in terms of the evidence base and the willingness to debate and discuss that evidence base. And at the same time, in general, at least that's something we're discussing in Europe a lot now, is also the willingness to rediscover, and I consciously say rediscover, the value of democratic debate. That we have reached an age where we all seem to position ourselves and no longer have the skills even to have a very, very serious debate. Because even if we have evidence, we do have elements where that evidence might be slightly differently interpreted, at least what the consequence of the evidence will be in terms of policies. So I think, you know, the louder in the sense of being part of, as you know, the UN lingo says, whole of society approach, that is so critical. And I think particularly if young professionals, I see so many of you in the room here, you know, take this up, take it into society and move it forward. And of course, the role still also of classic media, etc., is absolutely critical, and hold people to account. And that is really the very, very critical element.
Renee, any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I just really want to amplify that amazing point from the standpoint that data itself, right, doesn't move people to action. I mean, we have known data and the climate science for decades. So while we process the data up here, it's often in here, in our heart, that actually causes us to act. And I think that's just to pull out that thread and amplify it a little bit more, is that it's really that story and the narrative. I mean, we are narrative creatures, and so we have to put faces on all of this data, and it has to translate into the communities that people are trying to engage in and tell the stories of people there locally, because you know, nothing, at least I'd like to believe, right, that nothing's going to cause people to act more than like hearing a story about a neighbor. And so I just would reiterate that, you know, if we need money and political will, right, around this, that the collective way to get there, to amplify the voice, is to tell stories and put the human face to what it is that we're doing.
So I could keep going, but Chris has a train to catch, so we're going to let you go.
Thank you.
But before you do, just big round of applause for our fabulous panel. Thank you. You should run.
I should.
You should run.
It was great to meet you. Appreciate you. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Ilona. Thank you, Renee. And I'm going to turn it back to Kamran, who's going to, I think, say a few remarks, and then we will move quickly after that to reception.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we should congratulate our panel again. That was a rare panel where I was as enthused, probably more enthused at the end, even more so than when I started. So thank you all very much. So my job is to quickly summarize. So Renee began by asking 3 questions. How does climate change threaten universal health coverage? And she gave us 5 ways in which it does so. I won't list all of those, but you saw those. The second question was, who is most vulnerable? And I think that was very clearly depicted by the figure that was shown. The people who are struggling to be reached by universal health coverage are also the most vulnerable to climate change, and that's a very kind of a gripping image as far as I'm concerned. And then the next question, of course, is how best can we move forward? And there were 5 potential ways that were suggested. And that set us up very neatly for the debate that we had, and I thought that was fascinating. So thank you again. Let me just revisit some of the points made. Ilona talked about how WHO is already looking at climate change and universal health coverage together, how climate change is a central part of thinking at WHO, which is important. The potential of NCDs to drive the agenda forward, particularly food. And then she touched on, I think, what is one of the kind of hot topics, which is the development of new economic models. And that isn't going to go away. I think the momentum for that is going to increase. Chris, in that initial conversation, spoke about various elements. I mean, I think one of the most interesting was this issue of CO2 and how that is going to be an emerging threat to our nutritional status and potentially the nutritional value of plants and food that we consume. And she also, I think, very pertinently made us aware, once again, reminded us that we are not prepared at all for the temperature change that we can expect in the coming decades. So these were things to kind of very much worry about. Renee gave us a potential way forward again, which in addition to what she'd done before, which was the hope of technology, how technology can perhaps help us bridge the divide between the 2 camps of climate change and health, and where both may be intransigent to the other, technology could help perhaps bring people closer together. So, this was all fascinating enough before we then got on to some even more controversial areas, mostly introduced by Ashish. Thank you very much for that. And I think one of the interesting points of disagreement was whether or not there was systems thinking within the public health community, and perhaps that's, as Ilona I think suggested, that could be driven by national agendas, so that maybe one thing in the US but something else elsewhere. And then I think it's become clear that the problem is from both sides. So health people not thinking enough about climate change, the climate people not thinking enough about health. And ultimately, this is calling on our courage to do the right thing, which we may lack, and we need to instill that courage within our politicians. So, how do we do this? I mean, one way might be to do what Ilona said, which is to ask ourselves, what are the SDGs really about? How do we give people a better life? I mean, that might be a very neat way of capturing how we plan and strategize for the future of bringing any camp together, but certainly the 2 camps of health and climate change. Because very clearly politicians do respond to people. The only caveat I'd put on that, and from my experience as an editor, we see this on a daily basis. If you publish something, there's a dichotomy of opinion, especially when it's something controversial. And the way society is going, it seems to be increasingly polarized. And while that persuasion might work with one half of the population, the other half, perhaps responsive to certain politicians, is less open to thinking about climate change and universal health coverage. And my concern is, how do we penetrate the whole of society when large chunks of it seem to be resistant to the arguments that we're trying to put forward? But perhaps the answer again is to think about the future and think about children, and that's all been so prominent this week. And I like the notion of somehow restoring democratic debate. I don't know why that rang synergies in my head with what's happening in the UK this week, but certainly restoring democratic debate is something that's very important. So, before I finish, I want to thank you all. That's been a wonderful session. But we're so close to Broadway here, and if you look at some of the posters, if you understand musical theatre, there's one concept of a performer in musical theatre which some of you might be aware of, which is the notion of triple threat. Okay, so triple threat in musical theatre means that you can sing, you can dance, you can act to a professional level in all three areas. I mean, Ashish is the kind of the triple threat of public health world. You can do everything. So it's what. So what I'd say, we're so close to Broadway. We're so close to the concept of triple threat. Let's carry that forward in everything we do. Let's not just walk the talk. Let's sing and dance the talk of collaboration, of talking about climate change, of prioritising it, prioritising universal health coverage, but also act to make it happen and make that those three things our priority as we move forward. So that when we meet again, hopefully at a future date, we can look back and think of the concrete steps we've made towards progressing and achieving the targets that we've set for 2030. So thank you very much. Before I hand over back to Ashish to finish, I'd just like to thank my colleagues who worked on this series of articles, at the BMJ and at Harvard again for organising this event, for our wonderful panel, and to all of you for joining us today. So thank you very much.
All right, so reception starts at 6:30. It is 6:29, so I'm going to finish up in 30 seconds. Huge thanks to Olivia and Megan who pulled this whole thing off. It has been a 3-year journey, so Kamran, you, Fee, Sophie, the whole BMJ team. Look, these are two enormously complicated topics, and this is the beginning of a discussion. But it is discussions like these, and it's when you bring ideas together that real progress happens. And on both of these issues, the time for movement is ripe. And they will not take care of themselves. It is true that in the long run, truth wins, but in the long run, to quote John Keynes, we're all dead. So the long run is fine. We've got to get working because our timeline is short. These agendas are really important. We measure success in them by lives saved, and there is no better time to get going, except there is a reception. Please join us for a drink, and let's get going. Thank you, guys.